3 lanterns cut through the August darkness like dying stars. The footsteps crunching across dry Alabama earth belonged to men who'd learned to walk without fear. Plantation owner Charles Brackett, his Irish overseer Patrick Donnelly, and the cruel-handed Wade Pritchard. But tonight, their boots hesitated. Tonight, something made their fingers tremble around the lantern handles as they approached the cabin at the edge of the cotton fields. Inside that structure of rotting pine lived the man every overseer from Talbot County to Mobile whispered about when they thought no one was listening. His name was Ezekiel, and what they were about to find would shake the foundations of everything they believed. The cabin door stood 15 feet ahead. Brackett raised his hand, stopping the others. Sweat rolled down his neck despite the evening breeze. He'd searched slave quarters 100 times before. This shouldn't feel different. But it did. 3 months earlier, 2 of his slaves had vanished, a woman named Naomi and her boy, gone like smoke in wind. No bodies. No trail. Just empty space where human beings used to stand. Then last month, Tobias disappeared. A strong field hand who'd never shown signs of running. Gone. Someone was helping them escape. And every whisper, every sideways glance from other plantation owners pointed to the same man sitting inside that cabin right now. But Ezekiel's reputation went deeper than helping runaways. The stories spread through 7 plantations like wildfire through dried cotton. They said he could read the night sky like white men read newspapers. That he knew every creek, every patrol route, every sympathetic face between here and the Tennessee border. Some claimed he could navigate by touching moss on trees, by listening to how water flowed over stones. The most dangerous rumor, though, the one that made Brackett's blood run cold, was that Ezekiel was teaching. In the hours between sunset and midnight, when exhaustion should have pulled every slave into dreamless sleep, knowledge was changing hands. Letters scratched in dirt. Geography lessons disguised as stories about faraway kingdoms. Maps that lived only in memory because paper could be found and burned. Teaching slaves to read was illegal in Alabama. The punishment could strip a man of everything: family, familiar faces, even the plot of earth he'd called home. Yet the teaching continued. And Brackett knew, deep in the part of himself he didn't like to examine, that an educated slave was more dangerous than 10 men with knives. Patrick Donnelly shifted his weight, making his lantern swing. We doing this or not? Brackett had seen fear before. He'd watched men face down charging horses, deadly snakes, storms that tore roofs from buildings. But he'd never seen what he witnessed 2 weeks ago when Donnelly mentioned searching Ezekiel's cabin. The overseer's face had gone pale. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. That one's different, Mr. Brackett. He looks at you, and it's like he's reading words written on your soul. Now, standing in the August heat with insects screaming from the tree line and darkness pressing in from all sides, Brackett understood what Donnelly meant. Because somewhere behind that door sat a man whose eyes held something that couldn't be whipped out or sold away. Something that calculated and remembered and waited for its moment. Wade Pritchard spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Let's get this done. I got better things to do than stand here sweating. But even Pritchard's voice carried an edge tonight. Even he felt it. Brackett took a breath. They'd find evidence of the escape network. They'd find proof. And then this dangerous mind would be sold so far south that even his precious knowledge couldn't save him from the sugarcane fields of Louisiana, where most men lasted less than 7 years. He nodded once. Donnelly moved forward. His boot hit the cabin steps. The door was about to be kicked open. And nothing would ever be the same again. If you're already hooked by what they're about to discover, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about resistance, knowledge, and the true meaning of danger in 1849 Alabama. But before we watch that door come crashing down, you need to understand how a boy from the Gold Coast became the most feared man on 7 Alabama plantations. Ezekiel was 14 years old when the slavers came to his village in 1829. He'd been collecting water from the river, clay pot balanced on his shoulder, when hands grabbed him from behind. A cloth soaked in something bitter covered his mouth. The sky spun. Then darkness swallowed everything he'd ever known. When he woke, iron bit into his wrists. Around him, dozens of others lay chained in a holding pen near the coast. Men, women, children speaking languages he recognized and others he didn't. The ocean stretched beyond the wooden walls, endless and hungry. He'd heard stories about the ships that came to take people away. Stories that ended with silence because no one ever came back to finish telling them. The ship's hold smelled like death before they even left shore. They packed human beings in there like cargo, bodies pressed so tight you couldn't tell where your own limbs ended and another person's began. The air turned thick and hot, stealing breath from lungs. When the waves grew rough, the chains rubbed skin raw. When sickness came, and it always came, there was nowhere to move away from the dying. Ezekiel learned to count time by the screams, by the sound of bodies being dragged across the deck above, by the splash when they threw the dead into the Atlantic. He stopped counting after 27 splashes. His mind couldn't hold any more. The crossing took 43 days. Half the people who'd been chained beside him when they left Africa weren't breathing when they reached Charleston Harbor. Ezekiel survived by turning his mind into something separate from his body. While his flesh suffered, his thoughts flew elsewhere, remembering his mother's face, the taste of palm wine, the songs his village sang during harvest. He stored these memories like treasures, hiding them where no chain could reach. They pulled him off that ship in the summer heat of South Carolina, skeletal and hollow-eyed. When he spoke his own language, asking for water, the auctioneer laughed. "Listen to that gibberish. Sounds like a damn monkey." Other white men joined the laughter. Ezekiel filed that moment away too. He was learning that some people needed to make others less than human just to sleep at night. His first master owned a rice plantation where the work happened in water that came up to your thighs. Mosquitoes bred in those flooded fields, thick as fog, carrying fevers that dropped strong men into shaking, sweating wrecks. Ezekiel watched people die from those fevers. Watched overseers work sick slaves until they collapsed face down in the water. He survived by staying quiet, by working hard enough to avoid the whip but not so hard that they'd work him to death. Silence, he discovered, could make you invisible. 3 years later, they sold him north to Virginia. A tobacco farmer named Gerald Hess bought him at auction for $400. Hess had a daughter, maybe 16 years old, who sometimes brought water to the fields. She had kind eyes, the type that looked at you like you were still human. One evening, she caught Ezekiel drawing letters in the dirt with a stick, copying shapes he'd seen on feed sacks. Instead of reporting him, she did something that changed everything. She taught him. Not openly. Never where her father could see. But in stolen moments, she showed him how letters built words, how words built sentences, how sentences could hold ideas bigger than chains. Reading was dangerous. In Virginia, like Alabama, teaching slaves to read was illegal. But this girl handed him a weapon more powerful than any knife. When Hess died 2 years later, his estate was sold off piece by piece. Ezekiel went to a cotton speculator named Marcus Sutton, who was building an empire in Alabama. In 1838, Sutton loaded 23 purchased slaves onto wagons and headed west to a plantation he called Meridian Acres. Ezekiel was 23 years old. He'd been stripped of his homeland, his name, his family, his freedom. He'd been sold 3 times like livestock, worked until his hands bled, beaten for offenses real and imagined. Each sale had peeled away another layer of who he'd been. But his mind, his sharp, calculating, patient mind, that remained untouched. And now it held something his captors would never expect: the ability to read their newspapers, their documents, their precious words that they thought gave them power over people who looked like him. By the time Charles Brackett inherited Meridian Acres in 1845, Ezekiel had been there 7 years. Long enough to learn every path through the surrounding woods. Long enough to memorize patrol schedules. Long enough to start teaching others what that Virginia girl had taught him. Long enough to become dangerous. By August of 1849, Ezekiel had lived 34 years. His back told the story in raised scars, a map of cruelty carved into flesh. 20 lashes for looking an overseer in the eye too long. 15 for working too slow during cotton-picking season. 10 for being in the wrong place when Wade Pritchard needed someone to blame for a missing tool. The scars overlapped like rivers on a map, each one a memory of pain that tried and failed to break him. But if you looked past the scars, past the calloused hands and sun-darkened skin, you'd see what made plantation owners nervous. You'd see it in his eyes. That unbroken thing that lived behind them, a mind that watched, analyzed, remembered everything. A spirit that bent under the whip but never quite snapped. The literacy he'd gained in Virginia remained his most guarded secret for years. He never let on that he could read the newspapers left lying in the main house, never showed that he understood the documents overseers carried, never revealed that the words on shipping crates and seed bags meant something to him. Knowledge was power, but only if you kept it hidden until the moment it could be used. Then, in 1842, something shifted. A child in the quarters, a boy named Isaac, maybe 7 years old, asked him why white folks could look at marks on paper and know things. "What makes those marks talk?" the boy whispered one evening. Ezekiel stared at that child's curious face and made a choice that would define the next 7 years of his life. He scratched a letter in the dirt with his finger. "Hey," he said quietly. "This mark makes a sound like the start of your mama's name, Abney." That's how it began. One letter. One child. One quiet evening when exhaustion should have been the only thing passing between slaves at day's end. Within a month, 3 more children joined those secret lessons. Within 6 months, 2 adults, a woman named Ruth who worked in the main house, and an older man called Solomon who'd been on Meridian Acres since it was built. They gathered after dark in different locations, never the same place twice. Sometimes behind the smokehouse. Sometimes in the woods near the creek. Always when the overseers made their final rounds and headed to their own cabins for the night. Ezekiel taught them letters scratched in dirt because dirt could be smoothed over, leaving no evidence. He taught geography through stories about kingdoms far away, describing rivers and mountains and distances without ever admitting these places were real and reachable. He taught navigation by pointing at stars and telling tales about travelers who followed lights in the sky. To anyone listening, it sounded like entertainment. Like the kind of stories that helped tired people forget their troubles before sleep. But these stories were maps. These letters were freedom. This knowledge was a weapon being forged in darkness. Alabama law was clear as spring water on this point. Teaching a slave to read or write was illegal. The punishment started at 39 lashes, enough to leave a man scarred for life. But it could go further. Sail away from family. Transfer to the deep south where sugar plantations killed men in under a decade. Even death, if a master felt the offense warranted it. The law existed because slaveholders understood something they'd never say out loud. An educated slave was an impossible contradiction. How could you claim someone was property, less than human, incapable of complex thought, when that same person could read philosophy, do mathematics, navigate by the stars. Every slave who learned to read was living proof that the entire system rested on lies. So Ezekiel taught carefully. He chose his students based on who could be trusted absolutely. He varied locations and times. He never wrote anything down that could be discovered. The lessons lived in minds and memories, invisible to anyone searching for evidence. By 1845, when Charles Brackett inherited Meridian acres from his father, Ezekiel had taught 16 people to read. Some could only recognize a few words. Others could work through entire passages from the Bible that Ezekiel had memorized. All of them understood that this knowledge had to stay hidden, had to be protected like the precious thing it was. But Ezekiel was building more than just a school. He was building a network. Because literacy opened doors to other kinds of knowledge, like which overseers accepted bribes, which patrol routes changed with the seasons, which roads led north toward free states. Like how to forge a traveling pass if you had decent handwriting. Like which families had been separated by sale and where their loved ones had been taken. The teaching expanded. More students came, carefully vetted, sworn to secrecy. Children who learned their letters would grow up able to write their own passes. Adults who memorized geography could guide runaways through unfamiliar territory. The knowledge spread like roots under the ground, invisible from above but growing stronger every season. Ezekiel kept a journal too, hidden in a place no casual search would ever find. He recorded what he taught and who he taught it to. He documented cruelties witnessed on Meridian acres, specific incidents with dates and names. He saved scraps of newspapers that mentioned abolition movements in the North. He drew maps on any paper he could scavenge, showing routes that might lead to freedom. For over a decade, he'd been building this. An archive of resistance. A testament to the minds that slavery claimed didn't exist. A collection of evidence that could prove to the world what was really happening on these plantations. And now, on this August night in 1849, 3 white men with lanterns stood outside his cabin, about to discover everything. The trouble started in early spring, when the dogwoods were blooming white against the pine trees. Naomi had worked in the main house for 3 years. Quiet woman, maybe 25 years old, with a son who couldn't have been more than 6. The boy's name was Thomas. He had his mother's eyes and a habit of humming while he worked in the vegetable garden behind the kitchen. On the morning of March 17, 1849, neither of them showed up for their duties. Charles Brackett sent men to their cabin first. Empty. Blankets still on the straw mattress, cooking pot still hanging over cold ashes in the fireplace. Nothing taken except the clothes they'd been wearing. No note. No sign of struggle. Just absence where 2 human beings used to be. Brackett called the slave patrols immediately. Dogs tracked their scent to the edge of the woods, then lost it near the creek. The patrollers searched for 5 days straight, checking every road leading north, every farm within 20 miles, every hiding spot where runaways typically got caught. They found nothing. No torn fabric caught on branches. No footprints in the mud near river crossings. No bodies floating downstream. It was like Naomi and Thomas had been swallowed by the Alabama earth itself. Brackett couldn't sleep after that. He'd lost slaves before, everyone did. But runaways usually got caught within 48 hours. The dogs always found them, or the patrols spotted them trying to steal food from some farm. This disappearance felt different. This felt planned. This felt like someone had helped them vanish. He started watching his slaves more carefully, looking for signs, listening to conversations in the quarters, searching faces for guilt or knowledge. Most people kept their heads down, went about their work, showed nothing but the exhaustion that came from dawn to dusk labor. But one man met his eyes differently. One man stayed too calm when everyone else seemed nervous about the increased patrols. Ezekiel. Something about the way he carried himself set Brackett's teeth on edge. While other slaves hurried past white men with their gazes locked on the ground, Ezekiel would look at you for just a heartbeat too long before lowering his eyes. While others rushed to answer questions, Ezekiel chose his words with irritating precision. He never crossed the line into outright disrespect. Nothing you could whip him for, but the defiance lived right there beneath the surface. Brackett started finding excuses to observe him. Watched how Ezekiel moved through the quarters in the evening. Noticed how people seemed to gravitate toward his cabin sometimes, then drift away like they'd just been passing by. Nothing concrete. Nothing you could point to as evidence. Just a feeling crawling up Brackett's spine that this man knew more than he should. Then July came, and the feeling became certainty. Tobias had been on Meridian Acres for 8 years. Strong field hand, never caused trouble, did his work without complaint. Brackett trusted him as much as you could trust property. On the night of July 23rd, Tobias didn't return from the fields with the other workers. They found his cotton sack abandoned mid-row, like he'd just set it down and walked away. This time, the patrols searched for a week. They expanded the search radius to 40 miles. They checked every station on the rumored Underground Railroad route. They questioned every free black person within 3 counties. Nothing. Tobias had disappeared as completely as Naomi and Thomas. Brackett's paranoia turned to rage. Someone was operating right under his nose. Someone was helping his property escape, and that someone lived on his plantation. It had to be. 3 disappearances in 4 months didn't happen by accident. Patrick Donnelly found him on the porch of the main house 3 days after Tobias vanished, staring out at the slave quarters in the distance. "We need to search that one's cabin," Donnelly said quietly. He didn't need to specify which one. They both knew. "Ezekiel." "Yes, sir. That one." Brackett's jaw tightened. He'd been thinking the same thing but hesitating for reasons he couldn't quite name. Searching slave quarters was routine. You did it all the time, looking for stolen goods or contraband whiskey. But something about searching Ezekiel's cabin felt like opening a door you wouldn't be able to close again. "What if we don't find anything?" Brackett asked. Donnelly spat tobacco juice over the porch rail. "Then we keep looking." "But Mr. Brackett, I've been watching that man. The way people look at him. The way he holds himself. He knows something. I'd bet my wages on it." Brackett knew Donnelly was right. The question wasn't whether Ezekiel was involved. The question was what they'd find when they looked. And some deep instinct whispered that whatever lay hidden in that cabin would be worse than weapons or maps or evidence of escape plans. It would be proof that everything they'd built their lives on was a lie. But the rage won out over the fear. By August, Brackett had made his decision. August 12, 1849. The day would be recorded in Talbot County records as unremarkable. Cotton prices steady, weather hot and clear, no births or deaths reported on Meridian Acres. But what happened that evening would change everything for every person living on that plantation. Brackett assembled his search party carefully. Patrick Donnelly, obvious choice, the overseer who'd first suggested this course of action. Wade Pritchard, the enforcer, the one whose presence alone made slaves go quiet. Just the 3 of them. This needed to stay contained until they knew what they were dealing with. They planned the timing down to the minute. Dusk, when the field hands returned from picking cotton. Ezekiel would be exhausted from 12 hours under the August sun, too tired to think clearly, too worn down to hide evidence or mount resistance. They'd catch him off guard, search thoroughly, and finally have the proof Brackett needed to justify selling this dangerous man as far from Alabama as money could send him. The cabin sat at the southern edge of the quarters, maybe 30 yards from where the other slave dwellings clustered together. Beyond it, the tree line formed a wall of darkness, pine and oak growing so thick that daylight barely penetrated even at noon. A dirt path led from the fields to Ezekiel's door, packed hard from years of the same footsteps walking the same route. Standing there with lanterns as the sun began its descent, Brackett noticed details that seemed significant now. The isolation of that cabin. The way it sat separate from the others, closest to the woods. Most slaves lived in quarters housing 2 or 3 families, cramped and crowded. But Ezekiel lived alone in a structure meant for one person. Why had they allowed that? When had it been decided he needed his own space? Brackett couldn't remember the reasoning now, couldn't recall if there even was reasoning. It had just always been that way since Ezekiel arrived at Meridian Acres. And now that isolation felt like a warning they'd been too blind to see. The humidity hung thick as wet wool. Mosquitoes whined near their ears. Cicadas screamed from the trees in waves of sound that rose and fell like breathing. Lantern light threw shadows that stretched and swayed with each small movement, making the ground seem unstable beneath their boots. Donnelly checked his pocket watch. They'll be coming in soon. Brackett nodded. His heart beat harder than it should. This was routine. He'd done this countless times. Why did his hands feel unsteady? Then they heard it, the sound of feet on the path. Voices carrying through the evening air as the field workers returned. The voices died when they saw 3 white men standing outside Ezekiel's cabin. People hurried past toward their own quarters, eyes down, moving faster than usual. Nobody wanted to be near whatever was about to happen. Ezekiel came last, walking with the slow gait of someone whose body had been pushed to its limits. He carried a hoe over one shoulder, his shirt dark with sweat, dust coating his arms up to the elbows. He saw them from 20 feet away. His pace didn't change. His expression didn't shift. But Brackett noticed his hands adjust their grip on the hoe handle, knuckles standing out against the wood. The space between them closed. 15 feet. 10 feet. 5. Ezekiel stopped in front of his own door, still holding that hoe, looking at the 3 white men blocking his path. His face revealed nothing, no fear, no surprise, no guilt. Just a kind of patient waiting, like a man watching storm clouds approach and knowing there's no shelter that will keep him dry. "Evening, Mr. Brackett," he said quietly. His voice carried that careful neutrality slaves learned early, the tone that gave away nothing. "We're searching your cabin," Brackett said. Not a question. Not a request. Ezekiel's eyes moved from Brackett to Donnelly to Pritchard, then back to Brackett. For just a moment, barely a heartbeat, something flickered behind those eyes. Resignation, maybe. Or acceptance. The look of a man who'd known this moment was coming, and had prepared himself as best he could. "Yes, sir," Ezekiel said. He lowered the hoe carefully, leaning it against the cabin wall. His hands, now empty, hung loose at his sides. The reckoning had arrived. Brackett pushed the door open without ceremony. The hinges groaned, old iron complaining against wood that had swollen in the humidity. The 3 white men stepped inside while Ezekiel remained where he stood, just outside the threshold of his own home. The cabin measured 12 feet by 14 at most. Small enough that their 3 lanterns lit every corner simultaneously. The floor was packed dirt, worn smooth and hard as river stone from years of feet walking the same paths from door to fireplace to sleeping area. A single window broke the wall opposite the door, covered by canvas stained dark from wood smoke. Brackett's eyes adjusted to the dimness, taking inventory of everything visible. A mattress in the far corner, stuffed with corn husks from the look of it, a thin blanket folded on top. A rough table near the cold fireplace, its surface scarred and uneven. 2 wooden buckets by the door, one half full of water. A rusted cook pot hanging from a nail driven into the wall. That was it. The sum total of one man's possessions after living 34 years on this earth. The air tasted thick. Wood smoke from countless fires clung to the walls and ceiling. Beneath that, the sharp tang of sweat, unavoidable in Alabama August when you worked from sunrise to sunset. And something else, something herbal. Chicory root, maybe. The kind of thing people boiled when they couldn't afford real coffee. "Search it," Brackett commanded, his voice harder than necessary. Patrick Donnelly moved to the mattress first, grabbing it by one corner and heaving it away from the wall. The corn husks inside rustled like whispers. He ripped at the fabric covering, tearing it open, spilling the contents across the dirt floor. Husks scattered. A few weevils crawled out, disoriented by the sudden light. Nothing else. No papers hidden in the stuffing. No weapons concealed in the makeshift bedding. Wade Pritchard worked the walls, knocking on the rough-hewn boards with his knuckles, listening for hollow spaces where someone might hide contraband. He checked behind the hanging cook pot, ran his hands along the window frame, even examined the canvas covering for anything sewn into the fabric. Solid. All of it. Nothing hidden that he could detect. Brackett himself searched the table, checking underneath for items attached to the boards, feeling along the legs for loose sections. He opened both buckets, looked inside the cookpot, checked the few pieces of firewood stacked beside the hearth. Nothing. 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 15 minutes crawled by like hours. The lanterns burned, sending up thin trails of smoke that joined the layers already staining the ceiling. The heat inside the cabin grew oppressive with 3 bodies and 3 flames competing for the same stale air. Sweat rolled down Brackett's neck, soaking into his collar. His jaw muscles ached from clenching. This didn't make sense. The disappearances, the way Ezekiel carried himself, the instinct screaming that this man was involved in something, all of it pointed to evidence being here. Had to be here. But they were finding nothing except the expected poverty of slave quarters. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe paranoia had twisted his judgment until he was seeing conspiracy where only coincidence existed. Maybe 3 slaves had simply run at different times for their own reasons, and his mind had connected them into a pattern that didn't exist. Ezekiel stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the failing daylight outside. His face had become unreadable in the shadows, neither anxious nor relieved. Just present. Just watching 3 white men tear apart his possessions with the same patience he'd probably developed watching countless other injustices he couldn't stop. Donnelly straightened up from checking behind the table, frustration clear in the set of his shoulders. "Nothing here, Mr. Brackett. Just what you'd expect." Pritchard examined the walls one more time, slower now, more careful. Still nothing. Brackett felt his certainty crumbling. They'd find nothing because there was nothing to find. He'd assembled a search party, disrupted the evening routine, showed his hand, all for nothing. The other plantation owners would hear about this. About how Charles Brackett had gotten so paranoid he was searching innocent slave quarters based on nothing but a feeling. He turned toward the door, ready to admit defeat, to let this man return to his pathetic little cabin and his exhausting life. Ready to accept that maybe he'd been wrong about everything. Then Wade Pritchard's boot caught on something near the fireplace. The sound was wrong. Not the solid thud of boot on packed dirt. Something hollow beneath. Something that rang with emptiness when struck. Pritchard froze. Looked down. Then dropped to his knees. Here. he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sweet Jesus, there's something here." Pritchard's fingers clawed at the dirt near the cold fireplace, moving with sudden frantic energy. The packed earth that had looked solid moments before now revealed itself as something else. Loose soil carefully arranged to appear undisturbed. Dust rose in small clouds as he scraped it away, piling it to the side. Brackett and Donnelly rushed over, their lanterns swinging wildly, throwing shadows that danced across the walls like living things. They crowded around Pritchard, all three men now focused on that single spot where the ground had rung hollow. "How deep does it go?" Brackett demanded. Pritchard didn't answer, just kept digging. His fingernails tore. Dirt wedged under them until his hands looked like they belonged to someone who worked the fields instead of supervising them. 6 inches down. 8 inches. Then his fingers hit something that wasn't earth. Wood. "There's planks," Pritchard said, his voice tight with vindication and something else. Something that might have been fear. Planks under the dirt. Somebody built this. Somebody hid this. The three of them worked together now, scraping away the remaining dirt to expose what lay beneath. Wooden boards appeared. 4 of them, fitted together with such precision that the seams were barely visible. Someone had measured carefully, cut deliberately, constructed this hiding place with the skill of a craftsman who knew his work had to survive scrutiny. This hadn't been slapped together in an afternoon. This had taken time, planning, tools that slaves weren't supposed to have access to, and knowledge, the kind of knowledge that came from watching how white men built things and learning to do it just as well. Brackett's hands shook as he wedged his fingers under the edge of one plank. "Help me." Donnelly grabbed the opposite side. They pulled together. The wood resisted for a moment, swollen from years of moisture, reluctant to give up its secrets. Then it shifted, groaned, came free with the sound of nails releasing their grip. Darkness yawned beneath. A space maybe 2 feet deep and 3 feet square, carved into the earth under Ezekiel's cabin floor. The lantern light didn't penetrate all the way to the bottom, leaving shadows pooled in the corners. But they could see enough. Something wrapped in what looked like oilcloth lay at the bottom of that hidden compartment. Not just one package, multiple bundles, arranged with care, protected from the moisture that would have destroyed anything left exposed to Alabama's damp earth. This was deliberate. This was organized. This was exactly what Brackett had suspected and simultaneously hoped he wouldn't find. Donnelly lowered his lantern closer to the opening. The light caught edges of the oilcloth, revealing how tightly the bundles were wrapped, how much thought had gone into preserving whatever lay inside. "Mother of God," he whispered, "how long has this been here?" "Years," Brackett realized. This wasn't something thrown together recently. The wood had aged. The construction showed signs of settling into the earth. This hiding place had existed beneath their feet for who knew how long while they'd walked past this cabin daily, never suspecting. Pritchard reached down into the darkness, his hand disappearing into the compartment. He grabbed the nearest bundle and lifted it out. The oilcloth was heavy, substantial. Something with weight rested inside. He set it on the dirt floor between them, and the three men stared at it like it might bite. "Open it," Brackett ordered, though his voice had lost its earlier authority. Now he sounded like someone who'd just realized they'd been walking on a frozen lake and the ice was beginning to crack beneath them. Pritchard's fingers fumbled with the oilcloth, unwrapping it with the awkward care of someone handling something they didn't quite understand. The fabric fell away. And there, revealed in the lantern light, was something that made all three white men go completely still. Books. Not one. Not two. Dozens of them, wrapped together, their spines showing titles that belonged in educated men's libraries. McGuffey's Readers. A Bible with water damage blooming across its leather cover. Plutarch's Lives, the kind of classical text that plantation owners' sons studied in university. Brackett's breath caught in his throat. His vision narrowed to just those books, those impossible books that shouldn't exist in a slave's cabin. Because books meant reading. Reading meant education. Education meant everything they'd built their world on was a carefully maintained fiction. For the first time since they'd arrived, he looked back toward the doorway where Ezekiel stood. The man's expression had changed. That careful neutrality had cracked just enough to let something else show through. Not fear. Not even shame. Just resignation, the look of someone who'd known a storm was coming and had done everything possible to prepare, even though preparation couldn't stop what was about to happen. Their eyes met across the small space. In that moment, Brackett understood. This wasn't just evidence of helping runaways. This wasn't just contraband or stolen goods. This was worse. This was proof of the one thing they could never admit, that the people they enslaved were fully, completely, undeniably human. And if that was true, then everything else was a lie. Want to see what else they found in that hidden compartment? The discoveries get even more shocking. Stay with us, you won't believe what came next. Brackett lifted one of the books with trembling hands. The cover felt worn smooth from handling, the leather soft like cloth. He opened it to a random page, and his breath stopped. There in the margins, written in handwriting so precise it looked printed, were notes. Observations. Questions. Annotations that showed someone had not just read these words but wrestled with them, thought about them, analyzed them with the kind of careful intelligence that took years to develop. The handwriting was better than his own. Better than most educated white men he knew. Donnelly reached into the compartment again, pulling out more bundles. Each one revealed more books. A copy of McGuffey's Readers, the same primers used to teach plantation owners' children their letters. An atlas so worn the pages felt like tissue paper. The ink on some maps faded to ghost impressions from being studied over and over. Medical texts explaining anatomy and treatment of diseases. Agricultural manuals discussing crop rotation and soil management. And poetry. Wordsworth. Coleridge. Verses about nature and freedom and the human soul, with certain passages underlined, certain words circled as if they held special meaning to whoever had read them by candlelight in this hidden place. "He's been reading," Pritchard said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "All this time, he's been reading." But it went deeper than that. Brackett opened another book, a Bible with its spine cracked from use. Inside, passages were marked. Not just marked, cross-referenced. Notes in the margins connected verses from different books, building arguments about justice and mercy and the treatment of strangers in foreign lands. Whoever had studied this text hadn't just absorbed it passively. They'd engaged with it like a scholar, like a theologian building a case. Beneath the books lay something else. Journals. Not purchased ones. These had been hand-stitched from whatever paper Ezekiel could scavenge. Brackett recognized pages torn from old ledgers, the backs of shipping manifests, even the margins of newspapers carefully cut away and bound together with thread. The journals were filled with writing. Page after page of careful script documenting everything. Dates. Names. Observations about weather patterns and growing seasons. Notes on which roads were patrolled and when. Sketches of buildings and property lines. It was organized like a clerk's records, methodical and precise. Donnelly unfolded something that had been tucked between journal pages. A bill of sale. The paper was yellowed with age, dated 1838, the year Ezekiel had been brought to Meridian Acres. More bills of sale emerged as they searched deeper. Ezekiel had saved the documents of his own buying and selling, preserving the proof of how he'd been treated as property, passed from hand to hand like livestock. But it wasn't just his own history he'd preserved. There were other bills of sale too. Other names. People who'd been sold away from Meridian Acres over the years, their destinations recorded, their prices noted. A whole archive of transactions that treated human beings as commodities. Newspaper clippings came next, dozens of them, carefully cut and folded. Articles about abolitionist speeches in Boston and Philadelphia. Reports of successful escapes on the Underground Railroad. Debates in Congress about slavery expansion into new territories. Ezekiel had been following the national conversation, tracking the movements of people fighting for his freedom hundreds of miles away. Then the letters. God, the letters. Pritchard pulled out a bundle tied with string, maybe 40 or 50 letters written on scraps of paper in different hands, some educated, some barely legible. Brackett unfolded one at random. My son was sold to a man in Mobile. His name is Benjamin. He would be 10 years old now. If anyone reads this and knows of him, tell him his mother never stopped looking. Another letter. The Quakers in Knoxville will shelter you if you can reach them. Ask for Thomas Garrett. Tell him Ruth sent you. He will help. Another. They took my daughter south to New Orleans. Her name was Grace. She sang like morning birds. If she still lives, tell her I remember. Routes north described in careful detail. Safe houses marked by specific signs, a lantern in a certain window, a particular pattern of stones by a well. Names of sympathetic whites who would look the other way or provide food. Information that could mean the difference between freedom and recapture, between life and death. This wasn't just one man's collection. This was a network. Information gathered from multiple plantations, multiple counties. Letters that had somehow made their way here, entrusted to Ezekiel for safekeeping. Evidence of an operation that spanned years and involved dozens of people, all working toward the same goal. Preserving families, enabling escapes, documenting atrocities that the law said weren't crimes because the victims weren't fully human. Brackett's hands shook so badly he almost dropped the letters. The scope of what he was seeing crashed over him like water from a broken dam. This man they dismissed as property had been running an intelligence operation right under their noses. Collecting information. Coordinating communications. Building a case against the entire system of slavery itself. Every letter was evidence of families destroyed. Every newspaper clipping was proof someone was paying attention to events beyond the plantation. Every route marked on those scraps of paper was another escape they might have facilitated. Every name preserved was someone the system wanted forgotten. How many people knew about this? Donnelly whispered. How many were involved? That was the question that terrified Brackett most. Because looking at this archive, there was no way Ezekiel had done this alone. Information had flowed in from other plantations. Letters had been smuggled here somehow. People had trusted this man with their most desperate hopes and their most dangerous secrets. The network was bigger than one cabin. Bigger than one plantation. Maybe bigger than they could even imagine. And they'd just exposed it. Pritchard reached deeper into the compartment, his arm disappearing up to the elbow. When his hand emerged, it held papers that had been rolled and tied with twine. He loosened the binding and spread them across the dirt floor. Maps. Detailed, carefully drawn maps that made Brackett's stomach drop. These weren't crude sketches. They were precise renderings drawn on the backs of discarded ledger papers, the kind of documents that got thrown away in plantation offices, considered worthless once the numbers had been transferred to permanent books. Someone had collected this trash and transformed it into something infinitely more valuable. The first map showed Alabama in detail that rivaled anything Brackett had seen in official surveyors' documents. Rivers were marked with their names and depths. Towns were noted with distances between them. Roads branched across the paper like veins, some marked with small symbols that must have meant something to whoever drew them. But it was the annotations that made the hair rise on Brackett's neck. Tiny marks along certain roads with notes beside them: patrol Tuesdays and Saturdays after dark. Another notation near a creek crossing: dogs lose scent in water, wade upstream half-mile. Near a small town: sympathetic family, White House, blue shutters, ask for bread. This was intelligence. Military-grade strategic planning for escape routes. The second map showed Georgia. The third showed Mississippi, Tennessee, South Carolina, the Carolinas. Every state in the Deep South had been mapped with the same meticulous attention to detail. Patrol routes marked. River crossings noted. Sympathetic locations flagged. It was a complete atlas of underground pathways leading north toward free states. Some notations were in clear English. Others used symbols Brackett couldn't decipher, a language within a language, codes that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't been taught to read them. A star might mean safe house. A triangle could indicate danger. Wavy lines beside straight ones might show which roads to avoid and which to take. Donnelly unfolded another document. His face went pale. These are navigation guides. Look at this. Instructions for reading the night sky, using the North Star and other constellations to maintain direction. Notes on how to judge distance by counting footsteps. Techniques for covering tracks, for moving through water to confuse dogs, for traveling by day while appearing to belong wherever you were. And more. So much more. Teaching materials emerged from that hidden space like accusations. Flat stones that had been smoothed and marked with chalk lines, forming makeshift slates. Pieces of wood with letters carved into them, each one shaped carefully so fingers could trace the forms even in darkness. The alphabet rendered in wood and stone because paper was too risky, too easy to discover. Brackett lifted one of the wooden letters, a carefully shaped A, that fit perfectly in his palm. Someone had spent hours carving this, sanding it smooth, making it something a child could hold and learn from. The dedication it represented made him feel sick. Beneath the teaching tools lay more papers. Primers for children showing simple words and their meanings. Spelling lessons that progressed from basic to complex. Arithmetic problems worked out on scraps, addition, subtraction, even multiplication. An entire curriculum hidden beneath this floor, evidence of a school that had operated right here, right under their supervision. How many students? How many nights had people gathered in this cabin after brutal workdays, forcing exhausted minds to absorb letters and numbers and ideas that could get them killed? How many children had traced those wooden shapes, learning that marks on paper could hold meaning, that they could decode the world through reading? "He's been teaching them," Donnelly said, his voice breaking on the last word. "He's been teaching them. All of them. 4 years." The realization settled over the 3 white men like ash after a fire. This wasn't one slave harboring dreams of escape. This was systematic education. This was preparation. This was building something that could topple everything they'd built their lives upon. Every person Ezekiel taught became dangerous. Every slave who could read could forge a travel pass. Every slave who could do arithmetic could calculate distances and provisions needed for a journey north. Every slave who knew geography could plan a route. Every slave who understood navigation could find their way through unfamiliar territory. Knowledge multiplied. One teacher could create 10 students. Those 10 could each teach 10 more. The network expanded exponentially, invisible, spreading through the quarters like roots underground. Brackett's mind raced through the implications. If this evidence reached the wrong hands, abolitionists in the North, sympathetic newspapers, politicians who opposed slavery, it could ignite something they couldn't control. Other slaves would learn that education was possible. Other plantations would face the same organized resistance. The fear that held the system together would crack. And if slaves across multiple plantations were already part of this network, if the teaching had spread beyond Meridian acres, then they weren't looking at one dangerous man. They were looking at the foundation of a rebellion that had been growing in secret for over a decade. Pritchard's hands shook as he gathered the maps, trying to put them back in order. What do we do with all this? If anyone finds out. No one can find out, Brackett cut him off. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, like it was coming from someone else's mouth. No one can ever know what we found here. Because if they did, if the scope of this operation became public knowledge, every plantation owner in Alabama would panic. The violence that would follow, the searches, the punishments, the paranoid crackdown on any behavior that seemed suspicious, it would make what they'd already done look merciful by comparison. But keeping it secret meant living with the knowledge that everything they'd believed was a lie. Patrick Donnelly reached into the compartment one last time. His hands shook as they closed around a bundle that felt different from the others. Heavier, denser. He lifted it out slowly, like something that might explode if handled roughly. The oilcloth wrapping fell away to reveal bound pages. Not a book. Not a journal. Something else entirely. Pages stitched together with thread, the binding crude but effective. Donnelly opened to the first page, and his face went white. "Mr. Brackett," he said, his voice barely functioning. "You need to see this." Brackett took the bound pages. The first entry was dated March 1841, written in that same careful handwriting they'd seen in the book margins. But these weren't philosophical observations. These weren't notes about crop rotation or weather patterns. These were testimonies. Detailed accounts of specific incidents. Names. Dates. Descriptions so precise they could have been lifted from a court deposition. March 15, 1841. Wade Pritchard beat Cecilia, who was 6 months with child, for spilling wash water. 15 lashes. She lost the baby 3 days later. The child would have been a boy. Brackett's eyes moved to Pritchard. The overseer had gone rigid, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. The next entry, July 2, 1842. Charles Brackett sold Constance to a trader from Mobile. Her 3 children, Ruth, age 8, Moses, age 6, and baby Grace, remained at Meridian Acres. Constance begged on her knees. Mr. Brackett said she'd talked back once too often and needed to learn her place. His own name. His own actions. Documented with the precision of someone who'd been watching, remembering, recording everything for years. Brackett's hands trembled so badly the pages rattled. He kept reading because he couldn't stop himself. Page after page of testimony. Incidents he'd forgotten because they'd seemed insignificant at the time. Just the normal operation of maintaining discipline on a plantation. But written down like this, with dates and names and consequences documented, they looked different. They looked like crimes. October 8, 1843. Solomon died in the fields from heat exhaustion. He had asked for water 3 times. Wade Pritchard said real workers didn't need breaks. Solomon collapsed at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon and did not rise again. He was 52 years old. January 19, 1845. Patrick Donnelly ordered Silas whipped for alleged theft of a chicken. 25 lashes. Silas maintained his innocence. The next day, a fox was found in the henhouse. No apology was given to Silas, who carries the scars still. April 3, 1846. Charles Brackett purchased a girl named Abney at auction. She was 14 years old. Separated from her mother at sale. Mother's screams could be heard for half an hour after the auction ended. Abney cried for 3 days before going silent. Has not spoken of her mother since. Every incident was recorded. Every cruelty documented. Every moment of brutality preserved with the kind of detail that would hold up in a court of law, if slaves were allowed to testify. If anyone with power cared to listen. But this wasn't just about Meridian Acres. Brackett flipped through more pages and found accounts from other plantations. The Whitmore Place. The Caldwell Estate. The Sutton Farms. Ezekiel had been collecting testimony from across multiple counties, building a comprehensive case against the entire system. Deaths from overwork. Families separated by sale. Children born and immediately claimed as property. Women abused by masters and overseers. Men beaten for infractions real and imagined. All of it recorded with dates, names, witnesses when they existed. This was evidence. Legal evidence. The kind that Northern abolitionists could use in newspapers and pamphlets. The kind that politicians could read into congressional records. The kind that could make individual names synonymous with the worst excesses of slavery. Brackett's face had drained of all color. He recognized his own name appearing over and over. Decisions he'd made. Orders he'd given. Actions he'd taken that seemed normal, even necessary at the time. But written down like this, they read like a prosecutor's case file. Patrick Donnelly had started breathing hard, like he'd been running. This could reach the North. This could reach newspapers. They could publish our names. They could destroy us, Pritchard finished. His voice sounded hollow, like something had been scooped out of his chest. And it was true. If this testimony reached the right people, or the wrong people depending on your perspective, it would destroy them. Not just their reputations. Everything. Their social standing. Their business relationships. Their ability to show their faces in polite society. Northern abolitionists would seize on this kind of detailed documentation. They'd publish it. They'd use real names. They'd make Charles Brackett and Wade Pritchard and Patrick Donnelly into symbols of everything that was wrong with slavery. It could reach courtrooms if the political winds shifted. It could reach Congress. It could become evidence in debates about the future of slavery itself. Brackett forced himself to keep reading even though every word felt like a physical blow. The documentation was meticulous. Times recorded. Weather conditions noted. Witnesses named when possible. This wasn't the work of someone planning escape. This was the work of someone building a case. Someone who understood that truth, properly documented, could be a weapon more powerful than any gun. Ezekiel hadn't been preparing to run. He'd been preparing to expose them. To preserve evidence that would survive even if he didn't. To create a record that couldn't be denied or dismissed as exaggeration because it was too specific, too detailed, too carefully maintained. For over a decade, he'd been watching them. Recording their actions. Building proof of the humanity they'd spent their entire lives denying existed in the people they owned. Because every entry in this ledger was written by someone capable of complex thought, moral judgment, and the kind of intellectual discipline required to maintain records over years. Every page was proof that slaves were fully human. And if that was true, then everything they'd done to those slaves was unconscionable. Brackett closed the bound pages. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Around him, in that small cabin lit by flickering lanterns, sat the complete dismantling of every justification he'd ever used to sleep at night. And standing in the doorway, watching them discover it all, was the man who'd built this case against them, one carefully documented atrocity at a time. The three white men stood in that cramped cabin surrounded by evidence of what they'd spent their lives denying. Books scattered across the dirt floor. Maps spread out like accusations. Letters telling stories of families torn apart. And that ledger, that damning ledger with their names written in ink that wouldn't fade. Brackett's hand moved almost without his permission, reaching for one of the journals. He opened it to a random page and found observations about crop rotation, detailed notes about soil depletion and recovery, about which plants returned nutrients to earth and which stripped them away. The kind of agricultural science that educated farmers studied. The kind of knowledge that took years to accumulate. He turned more pages. Philosophical thoughts about justice and freedom. Questions about the nature of rights and whether they came from God or man or someplace else entirely. And poetry. Original verses written in that same careful hand, describing the Alabama landscape with language that made it beautiful and terrible at once. "He writes better than most educated white men I know," Brackett whispered. The admission felt like something breaking inside his chest. The silence stretched. Outside, night had fallen completely. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Closer, in the other slave quarters, people were settling in for sleep after another brutal day. Normal sounds. Normal evening. But nothing would be normal again after tonight. Wade Pritchard's voice cut through the quiet, rough and desperate. What do we do with this? It was the question they all faced. The terrible options laid out before them like roads leading to different versions of hell. They could destroy everything, burn the books, tear up the maps, scatter the ashes of that ledger to the wind. Punish Ezekiel with such severity that the memory of it would terrorize every slave on every plantation within 100 miles. Make an example so brutal that no one would dare follow in his footsteps. They could sell him to the sugar parishes of Louisiana, where the work killed most men within 7 years. Where the mortality rate was so high that plantation owners calculated it was cheaper to work slaves to death and buy new ones than to maintain them for a lifetime. Send Ezekiel to a fate worse than anything that existed in Alabama. Or they could face what these discoveries meant. They could acknowledge that everything they'd built their world upon, the belief that the people they enslaved were less than human, incapable of complex thought, needing white guidance to survive, all of it was deliberate ignorance maintained through violence and law. The foundation was crumbling. You could hear it crack if you listened. Every book in that hidden compartment was proof of intelligence they'd denied. Every map showed organizational skills they'd claimed didn't exist. Every letter demonstrated emotional depth they'd dismissed as impossible. Every entry in that ledger was written by someone capable of moral judgment. And if slaves were fully human, if they could think and feel and plan and create with the same capacity as white men, then what did that make the people who'd enslaved them? Ezekiel spoke for the first time since they'd pushed into his cabin. His voice came low and steady, carrying an accent that blended African inflections with Southern American English. The sound of someone who'd been forced to speak multiple languages to survive. "You asked what made me dangerous," he said. Each word was chosen with precision, delivered with the calm of someone who'd already accepted whatever came next. Not rebellion. Not violence. Knowledge. The one thing you can't whip out of a man once it takes root. The one thing that spreads faster than you can stop it. Brackett's eyes snapped to Ezekiel's face. In the lantern light, the man looked tired but not defeated, resigned but not broken. There was something in his expression that made Brackett's blood run cold, a kind of quiet certainty that said even this discovery, even this exposure, was something Ezekiel had prepared for. Even if you destroy all of this, Ezekiel continued, gesturing at the scattered evidence, the knowledge is already out there. 16 people can read because I taught them. Some of those 16 have taught others. The letters I've kept, copies exist elsewhere, preserved by people you'll never find. The maps have been memorized. The routes have been traveled. You're not discovering something new tonight. You're just finally seeing what's been growing under your feet for over a decade. Patrick Donnelly's face twisted. We should kill him. Right here. Right now. Burn everything and say he tried to run. And the others he's taught? Pritchard demanded. What about them? We need to know who else is involved. We need names. You need to face the truth, Ezekiel interrupted quietly. The interruption itself was an act of defiance punishable by whipping. But what were they going to do? Punish him for speaking when they'd already discovered enough to justify far worse. You need to face that the people you call property are just as human as you. We think. We feel. We plan. We hope. We love our children and mourn our dead and dream of freedom just like you would if someone tried to own you. Brackett stared at this man he'd dismissed as property. Really looked at him for the first time. Saw the intelligence in those eyes that had always been there if he'd been willing to look. Saw the dignity that 12 hours in the cotton fields couldn't erase. Saw the humanity that no amount of brutality could destroy. And the terror that brought was worse than any fear of rebellion or escape. Because rebellion could be crushed. Escapes could be prevented. But this recognition that the entire system rested on a lie so fundamental it poisoned everything it touched, this couldn't be unseen. If we let you live, Brackett said slowly, this spreads. If we kill you, you become a martyr. If we sell you, you take this knowledge wherever you go. If we destroy the evidence, you've already made copies. His voice sounded hollow. You've trapped us. Ezekiel's expression didn't change. I've just shown you what was always true. What you chose not to see because seeing it would mean facing what you've done. What you continue to do. Every single day. The lanterns flickered. Shadows danced across the walls. Outside, the Alabama night pressed in with all its weight. And inside that small cabin, 3 white men faced the impossible truth that their entire world was built on sand. They'd come looking for evidence of escape. They'd found something far more dangerous, proof of their own crimes, documented by the very humanity they'd spent lifetimes denying. The night deepened outside. Stars had emerged, indifferent to the crisis unfolding in that small cabin. They'd been inside for hours now, long enough that other slaves would be asleep, long enough that the normal patterns of the plantation had resumed without them. Time moved differently here, stretched and distorted by the weight of what lay scattered across the floor. Brackett paced in the small space, his boots wearing a pattern into the dirt. His mind raced through scenarios like a man trying to find an exit from a burning building. Each option led somewhere worse than the last. If he reported this discovery, if he called together the other plantation owners and showed them what Ezekiel had built, panic would follow. Every slave quarter in the county would be torn apart. Searches would turn violent. Punishments would escalate. The crackdown would be brutal enough to make what they did normally look merciful. And it still wouldn't stop the knowledge that had already spread. You couldn't whip information out of minds that had already absorbed it. If this archive reached northern newspapers, and God help him, Ezekiel had probably already planned for that possibility, Brackett's reputation would be destroyed. Not just damaged. Obliterated. His name would appear in abolitionist pamphlets. Those entries from the ledger would be printed word for word in papers from Boston to Philadelphia. Charles Brackett would become synonymous with the worst excesses of slavery. His family name would carry that stain for generations. Business associates would distance themselves. Social invitations would dry up. His children would grow up hearing their father's name used as an example of cruelty. Everything he'd built, everything he'd inherited, would be tainted by documented proof of what he'd done to maintain it. But destroying the evidence and punishing Ezekiel wouldn't solve anything either. The teaching had already taken root. 16 people could read, and some of those 16 had taught others. The knowledge was spreading through the quarters like seeds on wind, invisible, unstoppable, multiplying beyond any ability to track or contain. He stopped pacing and turned to face Ezekiel. The man stood exactly where he'd been for the past hour, patient as stone, waiting to learn his fate. There was no begging in his posture, no pleading, just that same quiet dignity that had always set Brackett's teeth on edge because it was so clearly the bearing of someone who'd never accepted his enslavement as legitimate. An idea formed. Terrible. Dangerous. Probably insane. But maybe, just maybe, it offered a way through this that didn't end in complete destruction for everyone involved. What if you were never here? Brackett said quietly. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed slightly. The first real reaction he'd shown since speaking earlier. What are you suggesting? Brackett's throat felt dry. What he was about to propose was treason against everything his society stood for. But self-preservation had always been a powerful motivator, and right now the path to preserving himself ran through a choice that would have seemed impossible 6 hours ago. There are intermediaries, he began slowly. Men who facilitate certain arrangements. For the right price. Disappearances that benefit all parties involved. Donnelly sucked in a sharp breath. Mr. Brackett, you can't be. Quiet, Brackett snapped. He kept his eyes on Ezekiel. You'd be sold on paper. Official bill of sale to a buyer in New Orleans. Everything legal and documented. But the buyer would be someone who works with Underground Railroad contacts. You'd be released to them. Given passage north to a free state. The cabin went absolutely silent. Even the insects outside seemed to have stopped their noise. Ezekiel's expression remained carefully neutral, but Brackett saw the quick intelligence working behind his eyes, calculating the angles, searching for the trap. And in exchange? The testimony about me specifically, those entries in the ledger that name me and detail my actions, those get destroyed. Burned. Gone forever. Brackett's voice steadied as the plan took shape. The rest of the archive, the maps, the letters, the general documentation, that can go north with you. Do whatever you want with it. Give it to abolitionists. Publish it. Just keep my name out of it. Pritchard's face had gone pale. This is madness. If anyone finds out we helped a slave escape. No one will find out, Brackett said, more confident than he felt. We have a legal bill of sale. As far as anyone knows, I sold a troublesome slave south and he died in the cane fields like most of them do. Problem solved. Ezekiel studied him for a long moment. You're offering me freedom to protect yourself. Yes. Not out of moral conviction. Not because you suddenly believe slavery is wrong. No, Brackett admitted. There was no point in lying now. I'm doing it because that ledger scares me more than breaking the law. Because if your testimony becomes public, everything I have gets destroyed. This way we both get something we need. Freedom for silence, Ezekiel said slowly, testing the words. Partial silence, Brackett corrected. You can take the rest. Expose the system. Just leave my specific name out of your testimony when you do. Donnelly found his voice, strangled and desperate. This is treason. This is helping the enemy. If this gets out, then we make sure it doesn't get out, Brackett said. His fear had transformed into something else now. Determination driven by pure survival instinct. We're already complicit just by finding this. The question is whether we compound it with murder and risk the knowledge spreading anyway, or whether we contain it through a transaction that benefits us. Ezekiel's gaze moved to the scattered evidence on the floor. Brackett could see the calculation happening. Freedom meant survival. It meant never picking cotton again, never feeling a whip, never living with the daily degradation of bondage. But it also meant sacrificing complete documentation. Those specific entries about Brackett's crimes would be lost to history. I want to take copies of the general testimony, Ezekiel said finally. Not mentioning you specifically, but documenting what happens on plantations like this one. The system itself, even if not every individual name. Agreed. And I want your word that the people I taught, the ones who can read now, you won't search them out. You'll leave them alone. Brackett hesitated. That was giving up control over the very threat he was trying to contain. But what choice did he have? As long as they don't cause trouble. As long as this stays quiet. And the other materials. The maps, the letters about families. Take them. All of them. Just burn the pages that name me directly. Ezekiel looked at the three white men, Brackett with his desperate bargain, Donnelly pale with shock, Pritchard silent with barely contained rage. Then he looked down at the evidence of his life's work scattered across the dirt floor. When? He asked. 3 days. I'll make the arrangements. You'll be transported with a group of other purchased slaves. No one will question it. The lanterns had burned low. Dawn would come in a few hours, bringing the field bell and another day of brutal labor. Except for Ezekiel, there would be only 3 more days of that. 3 more days, and then either freedom or a trap that ended in something worse than what he'd already endured. He had to decide whether to trust the word of a man whose crimes he'd documented in meticulous detail. Had to weigh freedom against historical testimony. Had to calculate whether survival was worth letting one guilty man escape judgment. I'll need time to prepare, Ezekiel said finally. To separate what goes and what stays. Brackett nodded. Tomorrow night. We'll come back. You'll show us what gets destroyed. It was an agreement born of mutual fear rather than any kind of justice. A transaction where everyone compromised and no one felt clean. But in that moment, in that cabin, it was the only choice that offered both men a path forward that didn't end in complete destruction. Sometimes survival required compromises that would haunt you forever. August 20th, 1849. The Talbot County Courthouse recorded a transaction that morning, one among dozens that summer. Ezekiel, male slave approximately 34 years of age, sold by Charles Brackett of Meridian Acres to one Marcus Holland of New Orleans for the sum of $900. The bill of sale listed no reason for the transaction. Just business. Just property changing hands the way property did every day across the South. The paperwork was clean, legal, unquestionable. But paperwork only tells one kind of truth. Underground Railroad records, preserved in Quaker meeting houses in Pennsylvania, in abolitionist societies in Ohio, in the careful journals of conductors who guided people to freedom, those records tell a different story. They speak of a man matching Ezekiel's description appearing in Cincinnati in the fall of 1849. A man who carried documents wrapped in oilcloth. A man whose testimony about plantation life was so detailed, so meticulously documented, that Frederick Douglass himself requested meetings to discuss what should be published. Some of that testimony appeared in abolitionist newspapers throughout 1850 and 1851. Articles describing the inner workings of slave education networks. Maps showing escape routes that suddenly became less effective because exposure forced their abandonment. Letters from separated families that made Northern readers weep and Southern slaveholders rage. The name Ezekiel appeared in a few of these publications, always carefully. Always without the full details that might allow someone to trace back where he'd come from, who had owned him. Certain names were conspicuously absent from the testimony, most notably Charles Brackett's. The descriptions of cruelty were general rather than specific. The plantation was called a large cotton operation in Alabama, with no mention of Meridian acres. Some historians have speculated about this omission, about why such detailed documentation would suddenly become vague about certain particulars. The most likely explanation, though it can't be proven, is that Brackett arranged the covert release himself, terrified that complete exposure would destroy him. That he paid intermediaries who specialized in such transactions, men who operated in the shadows between legal slavery and illegal freedom, facilitating disappearances for prices that reflected the risk involved. Whether Ezekiel truly gained freedom or whether the story is more complicated than records allow, we know this. Meridian Acres continued operations until 1865. Charles Brackett maintained ownership through the Civil War years, growing increasingly bitter as the conflict turned against the South. Sherman's march through Alabama in the spring of 1865 left the main house burned to its foundation, the outbuildings destroyed, the fields salted and ruined. Brackett died in 1863, never living to see the complete collapse of everything he'd built. Those who knew him in his final years said he'd become haunted, prone to staring at nothing, refusing to speak about the war or the future or anything that mattered. The cabin at the southern edge of the slave quarters, Ezekiel's cabin, stood empty after August 1849. No one else lived there. Some said it was because Brackett ordered it left vacant. Others claimed the slaves themselves avoided it, sensing something had happened there that changed the balance of things. The structure remained for 16 more years, slowly deteriorating. The roof developed leaks. The walls warped. The clay chinking fell away piece by piece. Finally, in 1865, during that same destructive march, the cabin collapsed into the Alabama clay from which it had risen. But what it had sheltered couldn't be buried by dirt or burned by fire or erased by time. The truth of full humanity, once revealed, once documented, once taught, doesn't disappear just because the building that housed it falls down. The teaching Ezekiel started continued. Of those 16 original students, at least 9 eventually made it to free states. The records are fragmentary, names changed, histories obscured for safety, but traces exist. A woman named Ruth who appeared in Philadelphia in 1852, working as a seamstress and teaching freed blacks to read. A man called Solomon's son, his real name lost, who joined the Union Army in 1863 and wrote letters home describing battles in handwriting that showed careful education. Children who'd traced wooden letters in that cabin growing into adults who understood that literacy was power, that knowledge was the first tool of liberation. The knowledge planted in darkness waited patiently for the moment to break through into light. And when that moment came, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, when the 13th Amendment was ratified, when the legal structure of slavery finally collapsed, there were people ready who already knew how to read, how to navigate, how to organize. People whose education had begun in secret schools run by dangerous men like Ezekiel. The archive's complete fate remains mysterious. Some pieces surfaced in abolitionist publications. Some testimony appeared in congressional records during Reconstruction debates. But large portions were never found or were lost to history. Perhaps destroyed in the chaos of war. Perhaps hidden so well they've never been discovered. Perhaps still waiting in some forgotten collection, wrapped in oilcloth, preserved by someone who understood their value. What we know for certain is that the three men who searched that cabin on August 12, 1849 discovered something that unraveled their world. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, inevitably, like a thread pulled from fabric until the whole structure comes apart. They discovered that you cannot enslave people's bodies forever without eventually facing the power of their minds. That education and bondage cannot coexist. That once people understand they're fully human, entitled to freedom not as a gift but as a right, no amount of violence can make them forget. And that power, once awakened, could never be chained again. Today, if you travel to Talbot County, Alabama, you can find the land where Meridian Acres once stood. The main house is gone. The fields have been reclaimed by forest. The slave quarters have vanished completely, leaving only depressions in the earth where structures once rose. At the southern edge of what used to be the quarters, near the tree line, there's an empty space. Nothing marks it. No historical plaque explains what happened there. Just Alabama clay and wild grass and the slow encroachment of pine and oak reclaiming ground that was cleared 200 years ago. But stand there on an August evening, when the air hangs thick with humidity and insects scream from the trees and the failing light makes shadows dance, and you might feel something. The weight of what was hidden and then revealed. The echo of teaching that happened in stolen hours. The presence of dangerous knowledge that refused to die even when everything around it was destroyed. The cabin is gone. The man who lived there is lost to history, his fate uncertain, his final years unrecorded. The plantation that tried to break him is dust. The system that enslaved him collapsed into civil war and reconstruction. But the knowledge seated in that small space still grows. It grows in the stories we tell about resistance. In the recognition that enslaved people weren't passive victims but active agents of their own liberation. In the understanding that education has always been the most dangerous weapon against oppression. What made Ezekiel truly dangerous wasn't the archive hidden beneath his floor. It was what he kept alive in hearts and minds, the unshakable belief that freedom wasn't something to be granted by masters but something to be claimed by people who understood they'd been human all along. How many other Ezekiels existed? How many other secret schools operated in the darkness? How many other archives were built and lost? How many other dangerous minds refused to break, kept teaching, kept resisting, kept preserving truth even when preservation meant risking everything? We'll never know the complete answer. History doesn't preserve the stories of people treated as property with the same care it preserves the stories of their owners. But we know they existed. We know they resisted. We know that every chain eventually breaks when the minds it tries to bind remember they were meant to be free. And that knowledge, that dangerous, powerful, liberating knowledge, is the true legacy of what they found inside that cabin in Alabama in 1849. If this story moved you, share it. These histories matter. These acts of resistance matter. These dangerous minds that refuse to be broken deserve to be remembered. And the question they force us to face, about what it means to be human and what it costs to deny someone else's humanity, that question still echoes in the empty spaces where their cabins once stood.